Hi everybody. I'm Nat. I write as TC Parker, and before I get started, I just want to say a really big thank you to Sadie for inviting me to get involved with this. I'm very excited to see everybody else's videos, and most importantly, happy birthday, Sadie! So hope you have a great one. I know it's coming up. So let's get started with the reading. So I'm going to read today from my Western horror novella, Salvation Spring, which is here. The text has gone a little wonky, so apologies for that. I'm just going to read the first chapter. Right, let's go from there. Apologies in advance also that I'm going to be saying this in a very British accent. So steel yourselves. She dreamed of the mines at Salvation Spring long before she ever saw them. She couldn't have said for sure where the dreams had come from, or what had planted the seed of them in the tired soil of her mind those nights she closed her eyes and saw herself approaching the mountains. When the dust would crackle under her boots, and the hot wind would burn through her lungs as she walked closer and closer to the hole torn out of the rock by older hands than hers, the hole she knew but couldn't know would lead her all the way down, if she'd only step inside. Some days, when her head was cool and her thoughts came easy, she figured she must have overheard something that tipped her off to the town and the mines. Picked up the thread of gossip at one of the bars she'd visited in Uriel or Holton or Sriracha City, and had the knowledge of the place sink unbidden into her bones. Other days, when her brain felt as cloudy as a mud-choked creek and those same thoughts slipped from her grasp like cutthroat trout, no matter how hard she tried to cling to them. She was sure the dreams were visions, a gift from God, beamed into her through means she had no chance of ever understanding. Either way, they'd come to her, and they'd talk to her, and she'd listened. Sasha had woken from them the first few times with only the vaguest sense of where on the map Salvation Spring might be, of where she'd find the mines if she went looking for them. But she'd asked questions and she'd started conversations, with the blacksmith at Sriracha City and the undertaker at Copper Forge, the cattleman at Harlem, and eventually she'd learned enough of the details to guide her there if she was willing to cross the desert. It took her weeks of travel, the crossing. Weeks of riding 10-hour stretches on the back of first the Palomino quarter horse she'd acquired in Santa Catarina, and then the tame black Mustang she'd traded for it in Copper Forge, the one she'd nicknamed Puppy Dog after it came and nuzzled at her neck by the fire one night. Weeks of sleeping on a bedroll under a calfskin tent. Those days and nights there were no towns or settlements or more comfortable accommodations in reach, while scorpions and camel spiders and the occasional rattlesnake crawled out from under the stones and tunnels in the sand that kept them mostly hidden while the sun was out. And then she was there, she and the Mustang walking slow-footed under the hanging sign bidding them welcome to Salvation Spring, population 300. It was a dead, dry place, like so many of the towns and settlements she'd passed through before. A slice of cobbled path laid on baked clay earth in the shadow of the hills above, the false front procession of hastily erected stores and barber shops and boarding houses tailing off to shacks and cabins and a tin-roofed chapel on the horizon. There was a funeral home, because there was always a funeral home, and a sheriff's office just next door, an empty set of 3-man gallows mounted beside it. Tufts of hair were caught up in the swaying hemp of the nooses, she realised as she drew closer. Hair thick and thin, fresh and faded, woven in red and black and blonde besides. An accidental tapestry of it, testament most likely to the unnecessary roughness of the executioner's grip. She rode on, the Mustang's lope decelerating to a crawl. There were no bodies at all on the thoroughfare, no drunks weaving unsteadily back and forth between the two saloons she could see, facing each other across the street. No ranchers bartering sides of beef for sacks of grain or delivering hides to the tannery. No old women in rocking chairs on the wide pine porch of the mercantile, making idle conversation over sweating jugs of iced water. Not a single solitary one. It was the heat, she thought. She could hardly stand it herself, and she'd almost had herself convinced she'd gotten used to it after so long in the desert, the brim of her hat pulled low over her eyes to block the unremitting glare of the light all around her. Sweating the whole time through the bleach-brown duster that was all that kept her flesh from cooking in its skin. You couldn't stay out in it for long and keep your hold on reality as firm as you ought to. Couldn't call yourself sane when the rocks and deadwood blurred and twisted in the shimmer, threatening to turn to shapes no lucid soul could bear. She drew the Mustang to a halt by the boarding house, tied him to the hitching post, stepped up to the entrance and knocked, the action sending a shock of pain through the raw knuckles of her heat-sore hands. "She's not in there," said a voice behind her. Sasha spun around quickly, the loose-fitting spurs in her heels carving shallow trenches in the parched earth under her feet. He was lean and long and leathery brown, thin crow-black hair that was half grease and half sweet-smelling pomade reaching down to his shoulders, and a ragged salt-and-pepper beard obscuring the pock-marked face that could have been anywhere between 40 and 60. His clothes were formal, as black as his hair. A frock coat over a button vest and necktie, iron dress pants and smart shoes polished to a high shine in spite of the dust swirling gently around them. She knew him, or knew his type anyway. There was one like him in every town she'd ever stopped at. There couldn't not be. "What's she?" she asked him. "The owner?" "Ella May," the man corrected her, sounding smoother than a man of his looks ever had any right to. "Lady who runs the place. She's in church, same as everyone else this time of day." He pointed a bony, hypermobile thumb over his shoulder toward the makeshift chapel. And Sasha shrugged. "Suppose I'll wait for her to come back, then." "No point. All the rooms have been taken up already. She's done accepting guests, even ones like yourself." "Ladies," he clarified, with what she interpreted as a pointed once-over of her duster, her riding boots, the patched denim jeans hanging loose on her rangy, underfed frame. "There anywhere else to stay in town?" she asked him, ignoring his stare. "In the spring? No, Ella May's all we got." Great, she thought, her back and thighs already beginning to ache at the prospect of another sleepless night on the bedroll, another sunrise waking to arachnid legs casting scuttling, kaleidoscopic shadows on the lightweight walls of her tent. Perfect. "Come to think on it, though," he added, tugging at the wispy, curling edges of his beard, "there might be somewhere yet. You happen to pass a brick house on your way over, about a mile south of here?" She shook her head. There'd been nothing but sand and lumber and whitewashed clapboard between Salvation Spring and the last ghost town that Puppy Dog had led her through. She was sure of it. A brick house. A real house. Something like that, she'd have remembered. "It's not far," he said. "Not far at all." "They got room?" "She, not they. Another she. And I couldn't tell you. Sorry. She's not a landlady, not like Ella May. Just a doctor. Or the nearest thing we got to one in the spring, anyhow. But she's got a spare bed she's been known to open up to travellers from time to time." "You know what she charges?" Sasha said, conscious of her almost empty money belt, of the handful of gold coins that were all she had left to trade. "Not a clue," he replied. "Not a goddamn clue. Why don't you head out and over there and ask her? Say old Rooster sent you." "Rooster?" If it was a nickname, she thought, then she couldn't so much as hazard a guess at its origins. There was something avian about the man, sure enough, with his hunched-over posture and his craning neck. But he should have been a nighthawk, maybe a vulture. Not a farm bird, not a rooster. Yeah. He flashed her a grin, his teeth the size and shape and colour of the coffin she could imagine him assembling for his customers. "Don't you worry. She'll know just who you mean." There we go. So the first part.